Hey, what's up? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about what happens when you slip up and misgender someone in a situation where that could have major consequences. This video is part of a series I'm doing on misgendering, how to avoid it and how to address it when it happens. I want to start with a disclaimer, which is that this video isn't about controlling what you say or limiting your free speech. Every trans person knows all too well that we can't make anyone gender us correctly. This video is simply about giving advice to those of you who want to respect your fellow human beings, but maybe don't know the best way to go about that for trans and non-binary people and are looking to learn. So with that out of the way, let's talk about when slip-ups have higher stakes. We all know that slip-ups happen, and they don't happen on purpose. And trans and non-binary folks are generally pretty understanding about that. We can tell when people are trying, even when they're making mistakes. If they're not trying and they're misgendering us on purpose, then that's a whole other issue, but we know when it's an accident, and we know no one's perfect. However, there are some situations where slipping up on our names and pronouns will have higher stakes and greater consequences for us. Situations like when a slip-up outs someone as trans. This could happen to someone who's just beginning their journey and is still closeted in a lot of spaces. Or it could happen to someone who's finished their transition and is now living stealth, meaning no one knows that they're trans. When a slip-up reveals someone's birth name. Once a trans person starts using their chosen name, then the only people who know their birth name are the people who knew them pre-transition. So when those people slip up on the trans person's name, that could reveal their birth name to others who never needed to know it. When a slip-up affects someone's first impression of a trans person. First impressions make a huge difference in how people see and treat you. So if you're trans and one of your friends slips up on your name or pronouns when introducing you to someone new, or if someone new overhears others misgendering you, that will affect their first impression of you and could make them more likely to misgender you too. Which brings me to the next situation, when a slip-up makes others misgender a trans person. This might be tied to a first impression, or it might not, but it tends to happen in situations where someone else is talking about you and misgendering you when you're not there to correct them. So other people assume that this person knows you well enough to know what your pronouns are and don't even realize that they're misgendering you. And then they start misgendering you too, thinking that they're gendering you correctly. And depending on how large your social circle is, this cycle just keeps perpetuating itself, making it harder for you as the trans person to course correct. And finally, when a slip-up puts a trans person in danger. Sometimes when slip-ups out you as trans, it's frustrating and hurtful, but not life-threatening. But other times, it could be really, really dangerous. Like when it happens in a transphobic environment where you'd be at risk of physical violence. Or when it could lead to you being doxxed. This is a big risk around accidentally revealing a trans person's birth name. Or when it could cost you your job, your family relationships, your access to housing, etc. Like I mentioned before, trans people know and understand that slip-ups happen, but when they happen in situations like these, that puts an extra burden onto us. The burden of having to deal with the consequences of your slip-up, and the burden of feeling like we still have to be nice to you about it because it was an accident. So if you slip up and misgender a trans person in a high-stakes situation like this, and they get more frustrated than you expected or disproportionately upset, please realize it's not because they think you did it on purpose and they're angry with you. It's because they can't go back and undo that situation. The damage is done, and it sucks. So how do we prevent this kind of thing from happening, or at least try to make sure it happens less often? Here are a few tips. Number 1. Learn to recognize which situations have higher stakes for your trans friends and loved ones. The types of high-stakes situations I've described in this video are all good examples, but of course they're not an exhaustive list. It would be impossible to come up with one because every trans person's life is different and carries different levels of risk. But a good way to figure out what kinds of scenarios might have higher stakes for your trans friends and loved ones is to consider these 2 questions. If you slip up and misgender your trans loved one, what would that reveal about them that others in the situation don't already know? Their birth name, the fact that they're trans, their private medical history? And what would the consequences of your slip-up be? A ruined first impression? An awkward family situation? The threat of violence? Answering those questions can help you be better equipped for any situation you might go into with your trans loved one. But just to be extra safe, it's also good to talk to them and get an idea of how high risk a scenario is from their perspective, how they'd like you to talk about them, how they'd like you to handle it if you accidentally misgender them, how they'd like you to handle it if you hear someone else misgender them, accidentally or otherwise. And this is all going to depend on what kind of situation you're going into and where the trans person is on their journey. Maybe they would prefer you to stick to gender-neutral language as much as possible and ignore any slip-ups so as not to draw attention to them. Or maybe they would prefer you to use gender-affirming language and acknowledge and correct any slip-ups you make. That's why communication is so important, so you're both on the same page before you go in, and you can use your game plan to avoid slip-ups as much as possible. Number 2. Practice gendering your trans friends and loved ones correctly. One of the best ways to make sure you don't accidentally misgender a trans loved one in a high-stakes scenario is to practice gendering them correctly in a low-stakes scenario. The least risky scenario is practicing alone because that guarantees no one is going to overhear when you inevitably make mistakes. But if your trans loved one is out to any mutual friends or family members and has given you all permission to talk about them and their transition, then that gives you some practice partners, which can be really helpful. If you do practice with others, just be mindful about keeping that low risk by doing it in a safe and private environment where there's no chance of being overheard. If you don't ever practice, on your own or with trusted friends, then what ends up happening is those high-stakes scenarios become your practice arena by default, which is the exact opposite of what you want. If you've been practicing before you go into a situation like that, then it reduces your chances of slipping up when it really matters most. I'm going to make a whole other video for this series about practicing and how to make it most effective, by the way, so stay tuned for that. Number 3. Work on combating the transphobic biases you've absorbed from the world around you. It's really common for trans people to get accidentally misgendered by those who knew us pre-transition. That's because those people are relearning our names and pronouns and other gendered terms, and making such a big switch like that takes time, so trans people understand and expect that you'll struggle. However, it's unfortunately also very common for trans people to get accidentally misgendered by those who never knew us pre-transition and met us for the first time as our true selves. And that's not so cool, because it means you aren't making mistakes because of how you knew us before, you're making mistakes because of how you see us now, and how you see us isn't accurate, or respectful, or affirming. Now, that doesn't mean you're a transphobic person, but what it does mean is that you've absorbed a lot of transphobic biases from your social and cultural surroundings, which is something we all absorb, including trans people, because we live in a world where transphobia is unfortunately a thing, and it's a very powerful force at that. So for any trans friends and loved ones you met post-transition, the way you practice gendering them correctly has to look a little different. It isn't about switching from one name and set of pronouns to another in your brain. It's about doing some work to unlearn what you've been taught about gender, such as gendering others based on the sound of their voices or the shape of their bodies. Combating those biases makes it easier for you to see your trans loved ones for who they really are, which in turn makes it easier for you to gender them correctly. Number 4. When in doubt, err on the side of caution. If you're going into a situation that you know will be high stakes, like a big party with lots of strangers, or a conference or convention, or a large family reunion, and you haven't yet reached the point where you're gendering your trans loved one correctly 100% of the time, then it might be safest not to talk about them much, if at all. Don't introduce them to any new people if you are still slipping up on their name. Don't tell any stories about something that happened between you if you're still slipping up on their pronouns, that sort of thing. Just in general, try to avoid talking about them in the third person if you can. Once you've practiced enough to know that you won't slip up and misgender them in a high-stakes situation, then you can talk about them more. But in the meantime, erring on the side of caution minimizes the risk of outing your trans loved one or putting them in danger. So those are my tips for avoiding accidental misgendering in high-stakes situations, and now is where I want to turn the conversation over to you. What tips would you add to that list? Have you ever been misgendered in a high-stakes situation, and if so, how did that affect you? Have you ever accidentally misgendered someone else in a high-stakes situation, and if so, what did you learn from it? And as always, what questions do you have about all this? And what other aspects of misgendering would you like to see me cover in this series? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, including the rest of this misgendering series, as well as cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. I hope this video helps you gender more people correctly, and I will see you on the next one.